I'm pretty excited to welcome Scott Berkun here today. Scott was a longtime Microsoft guy, and he was part of the original Internet Explorer team, actually several versions of the Internet Explorer from the early days. And he set out on his own about 3 or 4 years ago to start his own consulting business and actually write books. And he wrote a great book called The Art of Project Management, which is where he first came up on my radar, which is, I think, the first project management book I'd ever read that actually talked about what life was really like versus the kind of pipe dreams of fictional Gantt chart, PERT chart land. And so I enjoyed that book immensely, and I was very excited to hear that he was writing a new book on innovation. So he's here today to talk about that book called The Myths of Innovation. So please welcome Scott.
Thank you. So we good on volume? People in the back? You guys look so comfortable in the couches back there. You guys can hear me? Good. You guys just need to be smoking or something and it'd be perfect. Yeah, there you go. So first thing I have to do is reward the people in the front row, giving you books, because no one ever sits in the front row. And yeah, you get one. In fact, I have plenty of books. So this is a hint now because there are empty seats in the front 2 rows. So if you move forward, this is dynamic book delivery. If you move forward, you get books. See? Oh, check it out. This is so much fun.
I'm losing my shoulder room here.
Yeah, I feel like I'm at the zoo at the feeding time. You know. Now you guys get paid a lot of money, right? So like free books shouldn't be worth that much to you, but. Right. All right. Okay. Hey, you're in the front row too. You get a book. You pass them right through. Good timing. Okay. Actually, I was going to get rid of this whole stack. So who? Oh, you guys are all the way in the front. All right, there you go. There we go. Well done. You already have one.
I only need
one. Okay. Here we go. All right. The rest we'll save for later. Okay. So I have successfully dynamically reallocated space in the room. I'm very proud. That was a little social experiment because you guys haven't even looked at the book yet. You don't even know if you want one. But all right. So thank you, Ken, for the introduction. Thanks, Ken. And also Chad Thornton, who isn't here, was one of the people who helped get me here. So I wanted to thank him for arranging for me to talk to you today. So just so you know where I'm coming from, I'm going to talk to you about some of the topics from the book and some of the themes of the book that actually aren't even in the book. I'm going to go beyond the book. But I was at Microsoft for about 10 years. I was a manager guy there. I worked on IE 1 through 5. Worked on a lot of user interface features stuff there. Then I worked in the Windows group for a couple years. Worked in MSN for a while before I left in 2003. So that was 4 years ago. Since then, I've been on my own as an author and a consultant, public speaker. I wrote a book in 2005, which was a bestseller for O'Reilly, called The Art of Project Management. And this is my second book. It just came out. It's for sale on Amazon right now, but you guys are one of the first people to actually hold copies of it in your hand, at least those of you in the front row. The rest I'll give out. So I have about an hour. I'll try to end early, so maybe you can make it to your next meeting on time. And I'll say the last 10 minutes for Q&A. You ask a question, I'll give you a book. Pretty fair deal. So yeah, that means you got to stick around for the Q&A. It's all about incentive and reward. So the book's called The Myths of Innovation, which is kind of a curious title. The idea was take 2 things like chocolate and peanut butter that are good, and if you throw them together, no matter what happens, the result will be good. So the idea was innovation is an interesting topic, mythology is an interesting topic, what happens if you bring these things together. So the book, there's 10 chapters to the book. Each chapter in the book takes a myth that I believe is popular, even in the tech sector, even in companies that hire really smart people like Google, myths about how creative work is done, how new ideas become things, and how things move on to change the world. So each chapter talks about a myth, explains what the myth is, why it's so popular, what the canonical stories are that aren't true but that we believe, how they became popular, and then the focus of the book is how you convert that, looking at what the truth is, how you apply the truth to situations today that you're dealing with that involve innovation. So those are the 3 goals of the book. And I'm actually going to start by talking about the word innovation, because I'm actually not a fan of this word. The word is used all the time, and it's usually a placeholder for actually thinking, for actually doing something significant. If you look at the word, the many definitions of the word, the definition that holds it the best is this one, that to innovate is to begin or introduce something for the first time. It's a very simple definition. The criteria is pretty obvious. But most usages of the word go well beyond this definition. The most interesting thing to take away about this definition is the last comment. Am I doing that? Is my movement causing that to happen? Okay, just making sure. It's not earthquake warning. It's not nothing like that. All right, good. All right. The most important thing to take away from this definition of the word is that innovation is relative. And by that I mean this. If I were to tell you something right now, give you a new algorithm for how to do something, give you a new idea that to you was new and interesting and useful, then you would see me as an innovator. But then when you went to some other meeting or some other company or went out with your friends and you told them that same algorithm or that idea, they would see you as the innovator. And on it would go. It's a relative process. So anytime you're doing something you think is innovative, it's only because of the context in which you were doing it. At any given time, there are things that you take for granted as obvious, things that you think are very simple, very easy to do, that someone else will think of as innovative. Imagine what goes on right now in the Western world. At least 1/3 of the world, the whole planet, doesn't have regular electricity, 24 hours a day. So the idea that you could do that 24 hours a day would be an innovation in many parts of the world. So innovation is always relative. And we're trained as engineers and managers and technologists and designers that we like to believe there's a universal scale of innovation. That one innovation is going to be better than the next one. And it's this incremental thing that you can judge that's purely about this abstract measurement. And that's really not true. The best lesson from all the history of innovation that I've read, innovation is always a social function. It's always relative to the context of the people who you are trying to apply an innovation to. Other common uses of the word that you hear all the time, sometimes the word innovation is used to describe whoever is first at doing something. Not that they've necessarily done something well, not that they've even succeeded, but they've done it first. So the first person to do it. Other uses of the word involve better, that it's not about who was first, it's about who won, who created the better offering, who got better reviews, who got more market share. They're often seen as innovators after the fact, simply because they had something that turned out to be better. So there's a lot of misuse of the word. And I offer to you, anytime you hear the word innovation, you should become sensitive to it and ask people what they really mean when they say that word. Because most of the time they're being sloppy, and they're trying to apply all these words and glom them together, and they're trying to assume that the definition was something as concrete as this one, when really they mean something much fuzzier, much more ambiguous. The last thing I'll say about the word, this is the last etymology part of the talk, is about the difference between being successful and being innovative. That innovation is such a buzzword now that you hear meetings and conversations and business plans and startups that spend so much time focusing on trying to innovate as opposed to trying to be successful, as opposed to trying to be good, trying to make something that matters, that will solve a problem for people who are willing to pay for it. So in many cases, it's much better to use the word, is this progressive? Is this successful? Is this an improvement? Will this make things better for a particular person in a particular way? There's a much better way to think about managing than using the word innovation. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. Are there any architecture majors or students here? Any architecture? No, good. I can pretend to be the expert. All right, good. Anyone want to guess what century this church is from? Just raise your hand and guess. 13th. Anyone? Other guesses? 12th.
I'm going to say 16th.
16th, okay. I'm actually not 100% sure. But the answer, I believe, is 11th century. This is about 800, 900 years old, this church. Now, when this church was made, I know this church is in Ireland. It's in Northern Ireland. It's one of many churches you could find if you spent an afternoon driving around Ireland looking at old churches. And it's not particularly significant in any architectural or historic way. It's one of many churches you could find that are like this. The reason why I call this out as an example is that at the time this church was built, in the day it was made, there are many things about this church that were innovative in that time. Everything about this church that we take as obvious or pedestrian or utilitarian, because it's like all these other churches we have seen, everything in there was one day proposed and probably rejected by someone. The fact that there's a stained glass window, the fact that there's a steeple, those were all things that were added and invented and created. We discount all that because today, those innovations have become successful and adopted. We no longer see them anymore as innovations. We assume that they have always been. And there's a word for this. There's a word for this kind of thinking, discounting innovations of the past, and it's chronocentrism. It's not my word. It's a word that Tom Standage coined in a book called The Victorian Internet. Anyone here read that book? A couple people. Okay. So he talks about how the Victorian age of the telegraph actually paved the way for many of the things that we credit the Internet for. That's a little caption of that book. But anyway, chronocentrism is about this idea that the belief that what is going on right now, that the things you are making right now are the most important things ever in history. And the funny thing is that we're not the only people ever to have felt that way. That in fact, in every age, there was a group of people that felt that way. The Incas, the Mayans, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, they all felt that what they were doing was the most important thing forever and all time. So this is history of believing that technological progress and innovation is isolated to the present, to the moment, to the present moment. Now, I call this out for two reasons. One, because there's a pattern here. There's a pattern of thinking about innovation. And if you can buy the pattern, the guy who proposed the first steeple, I mean, could you imagine what that conversation must have been like? I mean, the church is generally not the most progressive group to work with. And if you have a new technological advancement, could you imagine what those discussions must have been like? To have that first idea accepted was probably very difficult. So there's a pattern around thinking about how innovations get adopted. And that pattern applies very well throughout time, throughout technology, throughout time. And chronocentrism is the denial of that fact. Anyone know what this is a picture of? This is the second detour on our history lesson section of the talk. Yeah?
That, if I remember rightly, it's a solar system model. Yeah.
You keep thinking. We got someone else, yeah?
It's an astrolabe.
It's a what?
Astrolabe.
Astrolabel. From where? From
Greece.
Greece. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know the?
Antikythera?
Yes, very good. Antikythera. So Antikythera is an island off of Greece. It's a Greek island. And this was discovered several decades ago. And what it's believed to be, we're not quite sure of its function, what it's believed to be is effectively a very early version of like the Babbage engine. It's a mechanical computational device. And this is at least 2,000 years old, somewhere in the ballpark of 2,000 years old. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this is not a popularly known example of technology. The first is that it's not entirely well understood what its purpose was. But the second, and more important, is chronocentrism. The fact that a technology existed this long ago that did some of the things that we're so proud of today flies in the face of our chronocentric beliefs about our technological prowess. There are many examples of this. There's an entire book called Lost Discoveries that catalogs entire realms of technology that fall into the same trap, where things that were developed and invented and understood and even used in some cases were eventually lost and then rediscovered and were claimed to have been done for the first time by a different civilization. This is the schematic that is believed to be what the device would have looked like when it was functioning. And our assumption is it was used for some kind of, you said astrolabe, but some kind of navigational, either astrological or used for navigational purposes for sailing. We're not entirely sure. The last point I'm going to talk about in this history part of my talk is about the fact that there are two pivotal innovations in this picture. Can anyone tell me what they are? There's actually many, but there's two that I'm thinking about. Yeah. The arch is one.
Stress concrete.
Stress concrete is good, but that's not the one I'm going for. Yeah.
Sewage.
Sewage, very good. So those two things were at one time innovations. And in fact, in the world today, there are places where sewage is not effective, and that's why people die from, I think it's 1/4 of the world still does not have healthy, clean, regular drinking water, right? So again, innovation is not diffused evenly. But I show this here because those two inventions were pivotal to the development of civilization. And civilization was pivotal to the development of electricity and computing and the internet and all of those things. But at some point, because of their success, those innovations were taken for granted. They are assumed to be self-evident, as if they had always existed. Just like the steeple in the church, or the stained glass in the church. Once an innovation becomes successful and becomes adopted, which is the dream of every innovator, eventually it becomes something that is no longer seen as an innovation. So that concludes the history portion of the talk. So now I'm going to go into mythology. This is a liberal arts tour through innovation. So this is a painting of a famous mythological event. Does anyone know what's going on here? You want to tell me? Just raise your hand.
Prometheus.
Prometheus, and what is he doing?
He's giving fire to
Well, it's close. He's not giving fire here. He's stealing fire, yeah. So the Promethean myth is one of the most popular myths in the Western canon. We like technology, and Prometheus was the guy, at least in the Greek mythology, which we as Europeans have inherited, in the Greek mythology, who liked people. He liked mankind, and he liked technology. Fire is a metaphor in many ways. It's a metaphor for creative energy. It's a metaphor for power. It's a metaphor for the ability to create. It's all those things wrapped up in one. And of course, it's also something that allows you to make tasty food, which is important. This is a painting of a scene that is very rarely shown in mythology. You won't find many examples of this scene. The much more common Promethean example is this one. the one at Rockefeller Center. So that's actually supposed to be Prometheus holding fire. I am Prometheus, I have the power. That's what usually the image of Prometheus that's shown. They don't talk about the fact that there was theft involved or that there's intellectual property rights that he violated. They skip past that and go right to the conclusion, which is, I have this thing that I am in control of. Now, it's telling that this is the center fixture. How many people have been to Rockefeller Center? So maybe half of you. It's actually a pretty crappy ice skating rink. So I don't recommend that you go there to ice skate. You should go there just because it's in the middle of Midtown and it's kind of neat to walk past it. Go, oh, there's Rockefeller Center. So the sculpture of Prometheus that's there, it's the center point for Rockefeller Center. And Rockefeller was a huge robber baron, billionaire, millionaire guy, very important guy for late 19th century America. Did some innovations, some that were legal and some not so legal. But anyway, that's the symbol that they put at the center of Rockefeller Center. Prometheus holding fire. And this represents many things, I think, to people who want to create, to people who want to innovate. That when you're sitting at your computer, when you're programming, when you're on your own, what you're trying to do, you're trying to create something for the world through you, and you feel like you are wielding some kind of force. And an image like this of Prometheus gives that a very externalized, visible symbol. You're holding the force. When you're about to release your software, it kind of feels like you have this thing and you're releasing it to the world. You are in control. You are like a god. There's a mythology around creation that is manifested by this image. And you'll notice that in this image, as you guys said, Prometheus is supposed to be giving fire to people, but it's not quite what he's doing here. He's wielding fire. This is like a weapon. This is like something he's in control of. So one of the myths in the book, the first chapter, is about the myth of epiphany, which is the myth that ideas and creative force comes from somewhere outside of us. That to have an epiphany means something happened in the universe, and by magic, an idea enters your mind, and that's where ideas come from. So there's a famous epiphany myth that involves apples. Anyone know the apple? Newton. Can someone tell me the Newton story? Briefly.
Sitting under a tree.
Sitting under a tree.
Hit on the head.
Hit on the head.
Two objects must attract each other through gravitation.
And that's how gravity was discovered. Okay, so how many people have heard that story? Okay, does anyone know where they heard it? What book they read it in? What teacher told it to them? Okay, a little scary, right? That's like the warning sign of propaganda. You don't know where it came from, but you know it, right? So the story actually comes from a couple of places, a couple of things. I'll give you the short version of the history of this myth. Newton had Newton's biographer. This was late in his life. He's 60 or 70 years old. He's a biographer writing his life story. And the biographer's trying to figure out, how do you get your ideas? Where do they come from? And Newton tells a story. I'm paraphrasing here, but he tells a story of how he likes to observe things in the natural world. He looks at the universe and the things, and he says, well, how does that work? Why is it that way? And he mentions an anecdote about looking out his window at a grove of trees, and that he might see an apple fall and wonder why that happened. So Newton, late in his life, is telling a biographer about observing an apple 30 years earlier. That's the story that is in the biographer's book. So from there we go to Voltaire. Voltaire, who was an innovator, he was a passionate guy, wrote all kinds of great stuff, got in trouble for it, was exiled from his country for writing great stuff. Voltaire decided Newton's ideas were really cool and he wanted to promote them, so he made the story one step closer. Newton is actually sitting there watching the apple fall right in front of him, and that's where gravity comes from. So Voltaire used the story of Newton and the apple falling as a way to promote Newton's ideas. And it's a better story. It's not outside of a window far away. He's now actually first person. He watches it fall. And then another 60 years go by, and another writer, Disraeli, I believe Disraeli, tells a story, and it's like a joke. It's like an aside of what if Newton were to be hit by an apple. It's a total aside that was told 100 years later by someone who had never met Newton and never met Voltaire. And that's the story that we know, which came from this iconic, second or third, it's like a telephone game, second or third retelling of a story that had nothing to do with the original intention or meaning of the story. It's now been abstracted out. So the epiphany story, as manifested here with the apple tale, is that ideas come from somewhere else that we are not in control of. Let's say, for the moment, that Newton actually discovered gravity, which is a tall thing to say that anyone discovered gravity, given how many buildings we had built before Newton's birth. But let's just assume for a second that we say that's true. Who's the protagonist in this story? The apple. The apple's doing the hard work. The apple is motivating action. Newton is the slacker. Yeah, he's lying there. Well, that's it. He's lying there under the tree, right? What is he doing? Nothing. The apple hits him on the head, and that's where the idea for gravity comes from. Now, the truth is, everyone knew about gravity. They built lots of buildings, and the Romans had built their irrigation stuff. We could build churches. We knew about gravity. We could not define all of the math, and that's really what Newton did. He characterized the mathematics of gravity and documented it in a way that could be reused for other purposes. And it took him about 15 years to do that. 10 to 20 years before that's how long it took him to finish and publish his treatise, the Principia Mathematica, I think, is what it's called. So even if the apple had struck him on the head, there was still 10 years of work required to document and do what he had achieved. So that's the myth of epiphany. So the first chapter of the book is all about the different kinds of epiphany myths that exist, why they're popular, and what the truth is, given all the research that we know about how creative activity actually gets done, what the truth is about where creative ideas come from. So I'm going to switch gears for a second and talk about corporations. I actually have 3 parts. I got this middle part's about corporations. Then the third part's about giving you some advice, pulled from stuff in the book, and then we'll break with 10 minutes left for Q&A, and I'll give away the rest of the books. So I wanted to talk for a couple minutes about 3M. Anyone here know what 3M stands for? Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. Can someone here tell me a product that they use made by 3M? Post-it notes. So what does Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing have to do with office supplies? Nothing. They manufacture it. Okay. But not in Minnesota and not with mining supplies. 1M, right. So the story of 3M is fascinating for this reason. In all the research I've done on corporations, the history of innovation, 3M comes up again and again as a stellar example. If you think of innovation at the grand scale, you're thinking of industry, you want to innovate in industries, multiple industries. 3M is a company that has done this again and again, where they have started out with a base in one industry, found an opportunity in another industry, and developed into becoming a key player in that other industry. So I'm going to tell you the short version of their story, their incubation story. They started out in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they were entrepreneurs. And in that time, this is industrial age. This is pre-electricity dominance in America, industrial age. Entrepreneurship meant minerals. It meant mining. It meant you were providing tools that would accelerate or contribute to the Industrial Revolution, the late part of the Industrial Revolution. So they discovered there was a mine near them they could buy that had this mineral that was used for abrasive tools, for like buffing and scrubbing metal. And they invested all this money in this mine. They started mining, and they're like, yeah, we're going to have stock options. It's going to be great. It turned out that the stuff that they had mined was the wrong mineral. It was the equivalent of fool's gold. It looked like this abrasive mineral, but it wasn't. So all their money was gone. So they had to decide what to do next. And rather than give up, these guys were serial entrepreneurs. In the late, early 1900s, they decided we're going to do this again. We're going to pick a different mineral. And they went after a mineral that was used for sandpaper. So they're staying in abrasives, but they're going to a different particular mineral. And that was where 3M started their successful business. And it took them about 10 years. Not an overnight success. It took about 10 years. They had a stable, productive, growing, healthy business making abrasion materials to use for sandpaper products. A few years go by. It's 1915, 1918, I don't remember, somewhere in there. One of the engineers who's making sandpaper, that's his job. He's a sandpaper engineer, right? That's his job title. It's on his business card. I engineer sandpaper. This is all new stuff, right? At the time, that was cool. He could go to a party and say that, and girls would talk to him. It was great. So he shows up at one of his clients with some new offerings they have for sandpaper, and he notices that they're working on a problem that they can't solve. The problem they're trying to solve, it's an automobile manufacturing company, and they want to make a surface that has 2 tones of paint. It's black and gray, and they don't have an easy way to separate the two and reliably reproduce this. So he looks at this problem and goes, well, the sandpaper stuff, I have adhesive on the back of it. It's got 2 materials that are bonded together. Maybe there's something I could do. And he starts playing. He starts prototyping, going off on his own. He starts playing around. He starts to like some of his early ideas. They're not complete yet, but he needs more time. So he goes to his boss and says, hey, I got this idea for a thing for automobiles. Can I get some time to do it? And his boss says, 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. Helping automobile companies paint their cars is not our business. Go away. Go back to work. Engineer goes back to work. He can't help himself. He likes his problem. He keeps working on the problem, gets it further, goes back to his boss. Boss says the same thing. Goes back a third time. Boss says the same thing. Eventually, he decides he needs to go stealth. He needs to go into skunkworks mode. And he knows he has some budget control. He can write receipts for up to $90 or $99 or something. So what does he do? He needs $3,000 to finish his prototype. He writes as many $99 receipts as he needs to and finishes his prototype. Finally, he has his prototype, and he shows it to his client, he shows it to his boss, and it works. And it's masking tape. This is the invention of masking tape. There was no masking tape before that. This is the invention of masking tape. There was no duct tape yet. Masking tape. Now, his boss eventually conceded this was a good idea, and they made it into a line of business. 3M now has masking tape. And that business grew. It grew faster than their sandpaper business did. The boss's name was William McKnight. And he looked at this and said, you know what? I was so wrong about this. I was dead wrong. You had to tell me 4 times to try this idea before I supported it. I don't want to make that mistake again. And William McKnight became the chairman of the company and embodied this philosophy of trying never to make that mistake again. And I'll talk more about him in a second. But that mentality is what led 3M to go from being a mining company making sandpaper to being a company that makes Post-it notes, being a company that makes highlighters, being a company that makes this wide range of products. There are very few companies that have succeeded on that scale. General Electric is another one, but their history is a little bit more complicated. So William McKnight, let me talk about him for a second. So William McKnight wanted to say, how do I make a pattern out of innovation? I screwed it up the first time with masking tape. I don't want to screw it up again. So he spent a lot of energy as a manager trying to correct the mistake that he had made. He's actually the guy, I forget what you guys call it here, 10% time, 15%, 20%? 20%. So that concept, the first use of that concept that I found in corporate history is 3M. They called it 10% time or something, 5% time, but they had the concept in their charter that every employee has the right to go and protect some percent of their time at work using corporate materials to do whatever they want. Let me read this. This is from a philosophy document that William McKnight wrote. It's 2 paragraphs long. I'm breaking a cardinal rule of presenting by having paragraphs of text up there, but let me read this for you because it's really good. As our business grows, it becomes increasingly necessary to delegate responsibility and to encourage men and women to exercise their initiative. I'm going to read this one because that's making me dizzy. This requires considerable tolerance. Those men and women to whom we delegate authority and responsibility, if they are good people, are going to want to do their jobs in their own way. Mistakes will be made, but if a person is essentially right, the mistakes they make are not as serious in the long run as the mistakes management will make if it undertakes to tell those in authority, meaning those delegated to, exactly how they must do their jobs. Management that is destructively critical when mistakes are made kills initiative. And it's essential that we have many people with initiative if we're going to continue to grow. So that was his attempt in 3 paragraphs to embody his philosophy of managing innovation in a large company. This was a document that he wrote. I really can't look at that. It'd be embarrassing if I passed out in the middle of the presentation. 1948, that was when he wrote this. But he lived this and believed this for many years before. So this is 60 years old. This idea is 60 years old. So I want to ask you guys a question. I want you to think of your manager or your previous manager, or if you want a manager at a company you worked for before Google, if your manager's in the room, you can use that as your way out. I want you to think of your last manager, the last person you worked for, and think about whether they embodied this set of principles. How many of you think that the last person you worked for embodied this set of ideas? Okay, 10. 15, I'd say maybe 20% of you say yes. That's 1 out of 5. Is there a question? Yeah.
So it's not always the managers who are making the mistakes. Sometimes it's the introduced processes that lead to that result.
Okay. So I'm not sure, how does that change your answer?
It's not an individual manager who made that decision to do things a certain way.
Okay. So you would not give the manager full credit or blame them fully for this? Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. So only about 20% of you raised your hand. So that means that the other 80% of you have worked in environments, I'm assuming it had some motivation or goal to be innovative that failed to live up to these principles. So my point here, this is about the chronocentric thing again. These are a set of philosophies that are old. Okay? They come from manufacturing, come from office supplies, which we would perceive as being technocentric-minded people all work in the tech sectors. Those are antiquated, dead industries. But there's something here, there's an essence here that's essential to effectively innovating. And this is one of the themes of the book. One of the themes of the book is that these ideas this is the hard part, especially this. Mistakes will be made. Could you imagine a vision document or a plan or a corporate charter that said that? That your budget would say $30 million, you can.
It's one of Google's 10.
That's great. That's fantastic.
10 things we found to be true.
Good. Yeah, I've read that. Yeah, that's fantastic. You guys, I'm sure you believe that you're an exception, that it's rare that companies would do that. Mistakes will be made is very difficult for most managers to swallow. Even managers in groups that are chartered with, it's one thing to say that mistakes are acceptable. It's another thing to make one and then deal with the consequences. Even in an environment that says it's accepting of mistakes, there's usually passive-aggressive or contradiction in terms in how people deal with that situation when it actually arises. Another myth, this is a myth that only shows up briefly in the book, is about organizations, size of organizations. So this is a picture of Saturn V rocket, the Apollo space program. The space program is in the Apollo 13 movie. The space program started in 1961, 62, and the space race mostly ended in 69 when we landed on the moon for the first time. So in that period of time, does anyone want to guess at how many people were involved in the US space program? How many people? You get a book. If whoever's closest gets a book. 5,000? 500,000? 30,000. 30,000? 100,000. This gentleman's correct. It's 500,000. Now, I'm including, you have to figure that NASA was actually the coordinating organization. Good answer. Did you work for NASA? Okay. You can't get to keep the book anyway. I'm just curious. So one of the reasons people forget that there were so many people involved is NASA was sort of the coordinating organization. But all the individual engineering work, all the individual innovations were done largely by different companies. All the space age. It's so funny how they still use that in infomercials as sounding cool. Because space age is 50 years ago. That's when all the space age technology took place. Anyway, all the individual components, the engines, the air conditioning units, the ventilation systems, the coolant systems, the materials, the metals, all that, the computers, all those things were farmed out to different organizations, different companies. Lockheed Martin, all the different defense contractors picked up different pieces. So all in total, there were 500,000 people that contributed to the making of the machine that allowed someone to go to the moon. So innovation is not something that's necessarily bound to the size of an organization. If you have some set of principles, and I'm not saying these are the only principles that have to be used, but if there's some set of principles and a leader who's able to uphold them, then you can innovate regardless of the scale of the organization, because the goals are innovative. So JFK was the figurehead, at least at the beginning. He died before the project could be completed, but he was the person who said, this is the goal. This is going to happen. Yes, we've never done this before. Yes, there are 1,000 things we've never done before. We're going to do this by the end of the decade. So he started off the whole project with a philosophy that embodied a lot of what McKnight would agree with. And you can find other examples, too. I mean, the pyramids in Egypt, aqueducts in Rome. You can find many examples of innovations that could not have been done if they were not in a large-scale organization. Now, one of the arguments that comes up a lot is how software differs from this or not. Is software a different kind of engineering that cannot make great innovations at a large scale? And that's an interesting question that we can talk about later if you want. But I'm going to move on. One of the things that's not talked about in the space program very much is the need for failure, that mistakes will be made. We like to sequester mistakes in our stories about successful innovation. We like to put them in a box and say that's where the failure was. So Apollo 13 is a great film. That's what this picture's from. Great film and very accurate film. Most of what happened took place pretty much as it's depicted in the film. What's not depicted are all the failures that took place before Apollo 13, which there were many. In fact, you can make a chart of all the failures that took place. And there's a huge number of failures that took place before the first man even went into space. How many people here have seen the film Right Stuff? The Right Stuff? Yeah, so OK. There's a sequence in there that's just spaceship exploding after spaceship for like 2 or 3 minutes long. And that was, again, we're sequestering the failure. Because you could have made a whole movie just about the failures. So Apollo 13 comes up a lot because it's this great heroic story where no one actually died. But there were people who died. Before Apollo 13, there were people who died in the Apollo 1? The engine test? Right. Apollo 1, all 3 crew members died. And that was years before Apollo 11, where we landed on the moon, and several years even later than the Apollo 13 mission took place. So it's interesting to look. The reason why I talk about the space program is that might be, to this date, the greatest innovation in terms of technical achievement that we've accomplished. Internet comes up a lot, but in terms of the sheer complexity and number of people involved, the space program putting a man on the moon has to be in the top 5 or top 10. It'd be interesting to have a debate about what should be in the top 10, but the space program is definitely in there, probably the top 3. If you look closely at any of those great innovations, you will always find series and series of failures. And that's how you learn to do the things that people don't believe can be done. So by making those mistakes. I'm showing a picture of the lunar lander for one reason. I want to offer you a reference. In case I've bored you or you feel like you know all this stuff already, there's a great reference for creators that's tied to the lunar lander. Tom Hanks produced an HBO miniseries called From the Earth to the Moon. Has anyone here seen that series? OK, only a couple of you. So it's this miniseries. It's a good series, but if you're not into space, you don't have to watch the whole thing. But I recommend that all of you watch episode 5, From the Earth to the Moon. It's called Spider. And what that episode is about is the engineering specifically of the lunar lander, which was the most complicated piece of engineering in the whole space program, because it was the only thing that had to go actually from the Earth all the way to the moon with people in it and bring them back. So the constraints that were on the design of that problem were super high. And what the story is, episode 5, it's like a documentary on the design process, the engineering process of making this thing. And it's fantastic. I guarantee you'll watch that and you go like, wow, that's just what the best team I ever worked on at Google or wherever else your best team experience was like. And I want to replicate that. I want to show that to my team, say, how can we be more like this? So episode 5, From the Earth to the Moon. So I am on the home stretch here. Good. OK. It's a fun game to play, to pick something that you think of as ordinary, something that you think of as obvious, and try to go back to the first instance of that thing. So this is an early prototype of the mouse. Thank you. No book for you. I didn't ask the question. But you get an honorable mention. This is the early prototype of the mouse. This was made in 67, 68, somewhere around there. SRI, Doug Engelbart. And you have to imagine, try to imagine, we think of mice as obvious things, necessary things, essential things. How could we not have a mouse? When this was made in 68 or 69, there were no PCs yet. Computers were isolated. Very few people had them. They were not commonplace yet. And some guy shows up saying, this is the future, looking like that. Not so good. As you find, you can take anything. You could take that video camera. You could take that microphone, these air systems, these projectors, and go back and try to find the first instance where someone suggested this thing as an idea. And almost always, the first instance looks ridiculous, looks silly, looks like it's a hack, almost always. And it's fun to go back and ask yourself, wait, if this is what the mouse, which became this essential thing in computing, this essential element in making the internet possible, making the web work, essential element look ridiculous, then what should be my criteria? What should be our criteria when someone comes into my office, someone comes into my room, someone shows up and shows, what should my criteria be? It has to be different than just the superficials of looking at something like this. It has to be something deeper, something else. Similar questions can be asked about the myths we have about great inventors. When you go back, when you look carefully at how they did what we herald them for, the story is almost always very different, more complex than we believe. So Thomas Edison gets credit for inventing the light bulb, which is a dubious claim because there are a lot of people who invented the light bulb. He was really the first person to succeed at making the light bulb work as a business and a system. But Edison's greatest invention may have been not any of his patents, not the phonograph, not the light bulb. It may have been the research lab. If you look at his patents, it's very rare that he shows up as the only name on a patent. All the famous patents he has had plenty of people involved. In fact, some of those people showed up in multiple patents of his. He was the first person that we know of, or first person who commonly gets credit in the West, in the business world, for creating a functioning research lab that could reproduce innovation. That's the Menlo Park Research Lab that eventually became Edison, Con Edison, the power company in New York City. So the story behind Edison is really a lot about myth-making. Edison promoted the idea of himself as a lone inventor. He promoted the stereotype that a lot of programmers like, of this lone genius, working alone, everything in his head, just having control over the things he could create and being isolated and alone, making things happen in that way. He promoted that myth because he knew it helped his business. It helped focus the attention on him, while his lab could actually go and actually make stuff. So the story behind any great inventor, if you go back to the beginning and you look carefully at how they made what they made, you'll almost always find it's very different than the mythology we've created for them, the convenient mythology that we've created. I'm actually going to skip this side, and I'm going to sum up my points. Hopefully I've said something useful. Let me try to come at it from a different direction here. So the 4 or 5 things I've talked about, the first is that innovation and design are ancient. As long as we have been here as human creatures in this genetic form, we have been innovators. We've been tool makers. We've been doing this for a long time. And the patterns and the challenges are the same. And if we're smart, we can look at other industries and other technological challenges and look at how they solve those problems, how they dealt with those patterns, and apply that to today. The second is that there's a mythology tied to innovation. Once an innovation becomes accepted, the stories that we tell about it change. Nobody talks about how we responded to the first mouse anymore. It's obvious that a mouse would be great. And all the people who wrote articles questioning Engelbart and saying he was a fool and an idiot, they don't talk about those articles anymore. They don't talk about those reviews anymore. As soon as something becomes accepted, there's a mythology that forms. And if you want to be an innovator, you want to be a star innovator, you want to come up with great ideas, you want to develop ideas into things that help people, you have to break those mythologies apart. The fourth is that organizations of any size can innovate. It's a misnomer. It has much more to do with how the group is managed and what the goals are, what the intention is. So I have about 10 minutes left for questions, and I'm happy to answer questions about anything I've talked about, or if you want to ask me something else innovation-related that you hoped I would talk about but didn't, I'm happy to entertain your questions, and you'll get a book. Yes?
So what myths do you think Google has around it that are questionable or ones we should be aware of?
Whoa. Okay. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so that's an excellent question. Could you pass this back to him? That's an excellent question. It's just that you guys outnumber me, and I used to work at Microsoft, so I know there's a dungeon underneath Building 42, and I don't want to end up there. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is there's this double-edged sword of uniqueness, the perception of uniqueness. And I think every great company has that. They believe that we are so different. We've done this so much better and smarter, and we're clever and unique. And they forget that just because you are unique doesn't mean there aren't similarities to what other groups have done, other companies have done that you can learn from at the same time. That it's not either or. You can be unique and still have situations that you can learn from what other companies have done. So that's the first thing that came to mind. Yeah.
I was just thinking the same thing when you mentioned how previous cultures have had the same instance of it, and it just sounds a lot more like arrogance than being better.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, in the back.
I was just curious, if you look at the story of Bill Shockley and the invention of the transistor,
Yes.
he managed the team that invented the transistor. And then
Would you mind coming forward? I can barely hear you. Thank you.
He managed the team that invented the transistor and then came out here and founded a research lab that just hemorrhaged money for its entire existence, at least as far as I know. So I guess my question is, at what point do you draw the line between, spending the money and entertaining the ideas that might have potential for innovation, or just losing money until whoever's got the money and is paying you decides that they've had enough, which is what happened to Bill Shockley.
I guess I don't quite understand the question. Just rephrase. Just give me the last part again. I didn't quite.
Well, I mean,
How do you decide between A or B?
About the mouse, for example.
Yeah.
People laughed at him, or the masking tape example. But there are a lot of things that don't turn out to be products.
Okay.
And if you have, if you entertain every idea that comes across your desk, you're going to lose money.
Fair enough. Yeah. So how do you decide?
Yeah. How do you balance it?
Okay. I don't think there's an answer. There's no algorithmic answer to that question because there are too many variables. There are way too many variables, and that's why innovation is hard. That's also why so many of the books about innovation try to say, if you just do these 5 things, you will win. And that's a lie. That's one of the greatest myths about this whole thing is you can't possibly, to put it another way, you can do everything right that you have control over, and still fail for dozens of different reasons. You can fail because a war breaks out. And the day you're going to launch, like think about this. I wonder about how many businesses were supposed to do their business launch on 9/11 that went out of business. They had great ideas. They had a great new product, but because they were launching on that day, they didn't have the money to come back around again and launch again. There are all these things that are out of your control if you are innovating because you are doing something new. So how do you decide? You have to put into play a whole bunch of variables that you can't control and decide which bet you're going to make. Which bet you're going to make. And I think a smart company, and you guys are famous for this, you can tell me if it's true or not, but that you want to have a lot of things going. And you want to have a cycle where every so often you're looking at the hopper and saying, OK, we've let these 3 or 4 things go for 2 months, 3 months. Let's pick 2 and fully invest them now. And then we'll do that again in 3 months. And we'll keep going. That's a pretty smart, organic, Darwinistic approach, and that makes a lot of sense. But there's money that has to be spent to support this incubator, right, while you're waiting for those things to surface. Yeah?
Over exactly what you mean that innovation is relative. Because surely, if you do something for the first time ever, that would be like an absolute innovation. And when you mention the idea that, that clean water is an innovation in large parts of the world, I mean, it's not, like the idea is already there. And so I'm not quite sure how that would count as an innovation.
OK, well then, when you start breaking down in the definitions, it gets fuzzy really quickly. So I guess what I mean by innovation is relative in that some of the ideas that you have working at Google, if you walk over to the building across the hall and say, blah, 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 idea 27, they go, yeah, we know that. You keep going and go to the next building over, they'll be like, wow, that's the best idea I've ever heard. That the value of an innovation on the innovation scale is always relative to people. It's relative to culture. That's what I mean. We like to think that there's this technological scale of the universe. And at the top is God or divine power or whatever. And at the bottom is, I don't know, ants or what, there's some scale. And you're always moving up the scale. And that's a very limited way to think about innovation. A much more useful way to think about innovation in this industry, or if you're trying to think about how to make the world better, is to think about it in the relative way. I have this idea. It's useful to who? Rather than this idea scores a 27 on my universal innovation scale. That's my point. Does that answer your question?
But if you come up with something that's the first time it's ever been done, then surely that must be innovative on an absolute scale.
OK, so I'll give you an example, right? This example from the book, the light bulb. Hey, Edison, light bulb. No one ever thought of lighting things before? No one ever thought of making an object that you could put somewhere that would illuminate a room? Candles, gas lighting, arc lighting. Go back to the beginning of this. You can always find the fancy word is antecedent. There's an antecedent. There's some idea that was before the idea you think is so amazingly unique that set you up for it. Yeah?
Do you think of standardization as a competitor to innovation?
I think it's more complicated than that. I think that you have to, here's what I'll say. Any standard that exists, you will find an innovator who thinks that. If I have a new protocol that I think is better than HTTP, then I will think the standardization of HTTP inhibits my innovation. So I'm using the relative argument again. Any standard that exists, no matter how good you think it is or we as a collective think it is, we'll be able to find a group of people that think it's the worst thing ever and is preventing progress from happening. So there's an inherent tension in the history of technological progress between, it's like a pendulum that goes back and forth in any field, that things are chaotic, so people push to standardize them. It gets standardized too much, it gets bureaucratic, it's no longer growing, and then something new comes along and displaces it, and then it starts again. So I wouldn't say that it inhibits it. It's a necessary part of the cycle. You're always going through cycles of standardization and then chaos and back and forth. Yeah? Yeah?
You sound like you're a fan of innovation, obviously. Have you done any sort of study as to, if you took sort of, I don't know, the 1,000 most successful businesses over the last 200 years, how many of them were underpinned by innovation and how many of them just did something and did it well?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd say I'm the biggest fan of innovation. I find it's a fascinating topic. I think that if you were running a small business on your own, with your own money, you wouldn't be innovating nearly as much as you would be if you're in a big corporation that is paying your salary no matter what the outcome of your innovation is. And I think of like if I had a pizza place or a corner store or something and I had this business I'm running and I finally get it working that I can make a living, I'm probably not going to reinvent my menu every week. I'm not going to reinvent it every month. I'm going to find a pace that I can manage that allows me to control change so I'm not getting left behind, but I am not racing to innovation. So if you look at the greatest corporations of all time, the ones that have lasted, they tend to be one that focus on, they find a way to balance the expense of innovation with long periods of pulling efficiency out of the previous innovation. So General Electric, IBM, who else? Intel is a good example. For a while, you could look at some of the car companies were actually good on that kind of thing, but not so much anymore. Yeah, in the back.
We're talking about precedents and ancient innovations. Do you think there exists some kind of separation at which point the technological sophistication will become so intricate that you will not be able possibly to innovate something unless you have billions and billions of dollars of investment and
yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think, I mean, you guys will laugh at this, but look at Microsoft Windows, right? You have a technology there that is 15 years old. And the complexities that people who work on Windows deal with, it's enormously large, and that inhibits innovation. And at some point, that has to decay enough that a new entrant could come in and be a superior offering to people. So I think that's definitely true. It's just a question of how long it takes and how long it takes before a new entrant is able to actually provide something superior from the old entrant. But yeah, that happens all the time. I mean, even outside the tech sector that happens. It happens in the automobile industry. It happens in every industry. Yeah, someone's going to have to pass this all the way back. You want to come up for that? Yeah.
So you cited several examples of who's an innovator in from the space program where there's no individual. I mean, Kennedy was there, but obviously he didn't build the rocket. Edison is cited as an innovator, but you showed he had a lab behind him. Mm-hmm. And then you had the masking tape guy who really did, but we don't know who he is.
Oh yeah, I forget. I think Art Fry is the Post-it note guy, but I forget. I know his name.
But it's not commonly known.
No, it's not.
So who's the real innovator? I mean, it's the individual, the group, the guy with the business.
It's a great question. So there's a chapter in the book. There's a chapter in the book called the Myth of the Lone Innovator. That's all about this question. And that's one of the reasons why the patent system is so frustrating. It's because the patent system forces us to identify a name. It says, who invented it? Is it Fred or not Fred? Is it Joe or not Joe? And when you break it down, when you follow the history of I went and I borrowed from this guy. I went and I looked at what he had done. There's so many fuels that contribute to any innovation. So I think they all deserve credit. They all deserve partial credit. So the masking tape guy, I feel really embarrassed now that I don't know his name. The masking tape guy. It might be Art Fry, but I think Art Fry has Post-it notes. Anyway, the masking tape guy, his boss, William McKnight, eventually said yes. William McKnight had a boss who eventually said yes. So there's a collection of people that are involved that have to get some credit. But I think it's fair to say that whoever's the champion of the idea, whoever has the most at risk in supporting an idea, those are the people that deserve the credit because they had something to lose. Yeah. Yeah.
So you said that we've been innovating essentially since the dawn of time or something like that. I wonder if you're familiar with a current recent bestseller called Before the Dawn.
Before the dawn?
Dawn.
Okay.
Which is indeed about the fact that this isn't true. The same set of tools was used in the Paleolithic for 10 or 20,000 years before any innovation appeared.
That's okay. I'm not saying it happened continuously.
The rhythm of innovation has been going on exponentially for about 100,000 years, and it's very interesting to understand why.
Okay.
The number of innovations actually happening in 1 year now are probably more than happened.
Yeah, okay, I get that. Well, so there's a bigger question as to whether those are the same scale of innovation. And this is an interesting thing to talk about. I felt bad about this too, but you compare like the invention of electricity to SSL security for web browsing. They're both innovations, sure. Which was more significant? Would you put those on the? If you're the universal innovator scaling system, you couldn't possibly put those two things in the same scale. And I guess I look at the patent system. I'm like a wannabe student or fan of the patent system. I look at patents as they go by, and you look at like the last 100,000 patents compared to the first 100,000. And there's this radical scale of significance as a human being for what they mean. So I agree with what you're saying, that there's an exponential curve to the number of things that we assign as inventions. But their significance, I don't know that we can say that the significance is climbing. It seems to me, sometimes I feel like, and this is anecdotal, I don't have data to support me on this, but sometimes I feel like the significance of them is declining. Or the scale of them is declining. But anyway, so the book, Before the Dawn?
Yeah.
Before the Dawn, okay. Yeah. Oh, you got one?
Richard Drew.
Richard Drew's the author?
No.
Oh.
Masking tape guy.
Oh, thank you. Very good. Okay. His name might even be in the book. I don't know. Oh, it is? Okay, thank you. Good. Feel better. Yeah.
During the research for your book, you probably talked to a lot of people, and Google always comes up around innovation. And I was wondering, what do people say around Google innovation? Why is Google innovative, or out-innovates people? Or
I don't think they know. I don't think that they know. You guys have a fantastic profile. I mean, you guys are the. You guys come. Actually, you guys are in the first chapter of the book. I've been here a few times before, and there's a story from. I snuck on a tour. That's the opening story of the book, and I chose that because if I'm writing a book in 2007, it's a good place to start. Is what makes a place innovative. But in terms of
Business Week, we're number 2. Apple is number 1, and 3 are number 2.
Yeah.
That's the latest.
But how do they come up with that number?
They asked 1,200.
Yeah, but I know that. But you got to figure it's 3 editors in a room with some beer, and they're like, "Oh, come on! I think it's Apple." No, have you seen the iPod? They go back and forth. So the short answer is that I don't think people know. And you guys, I remember this when I worked at Microsoft, is I'd read the high-profile articles about my company, and I'd be like, okay, like some of it's right, but some of it's, whoa, like I haven't seen that. So you probably read those articles, and you correlate for yourself how Google's being portrayed compared to how you experience Google. And you probably have a better sense of it than I do if you're reading those things. Yeah?
So a lot of times innovation also kind of goes hand in hand with need finding, and I didn't hear a lot about need finding, and I was kind of
wondering. Need, N-E-E-D?
N-E-E-D.
Okay.
Need finding in the sense of, even mythology was about need finding, the need to explain ourselves
Yes.
in the universe. And so I was wondering, when you talk about innovation and these things that come up, it seems like you look at them from the standpoint of, oh, here's this great idea. And I'm wondering what you see as kind of the precursors of actually doing the need finding and the studies that happened beforehand that led to that.
Yeah, so there is a chapter in here. I feel like an idiot. I don't remember what's in my book. Chapter 9 is problems and solutions. So it talks about the fixation that most people have about, I want to be creative. I want to innovate. I'm going to sit down and innovate now, versus the other approach, which is I'm going to look and see what's broken. I'm going to see what's not working, and I'm going to try to fix that. And if I need to innovate to fix that, then maybe I will. But I'm going to focus on the need. I'm going to focus on trying to find needs. So my position is that needs, there's way more examples of people starting with a need and a problem who innovated on their way by accident because they needed to, rather than people who sat down and said, look, I'm going to prove how smart I am. I'm going to innovate today. And just, let the muse strike me. There's definitely supporting evidence that needs analysis and going out to customers and paying attention and observing is a fertile place to be innovative or to start the process of being creative. Maybe one more question and then pass this back. Yeah.
So the thing about the space program, one of the things that we seem to have a little luxury here is that we do have like this 20% time where you can just do something that has no accountability. It's okay if it fails, it just goes away. But the space program, like you said, it had the end of the decade, we're going to be at the moon, and we don't know how to do any of this, and we're going to have to invent a bunch of stuff. So is there something that you detected that made it so that you could have macro scale accountability?
It's a great observation, and I agree with you that they were in a different set of circumstances. It was also nationalistic. They felt that if this was symbolic of the Cold War and that losing space would mean losing the nation, that whoever got to space first could drop bombs on the other guy. So there was this threat, there's this real threat. I mean, if you guys work at Google or if I work at some other startup and I go under, okay, I'm out of a job. Okay, like that's bad, but I'll survive. This scale of this was much greater. So I think there is something to be said for pressure. There's something to be said for feeling like you're up against the wall and you have to do this. There's no other way out, like the Apollo 13 story. I think there's definitely support for that, but I don't think I've answered your question because I've forgotten what it was. I got so excited by what you said, I just lost myself. Yeah, you want to give it to me again? Okay. How did they do it?
How did they do it?
So I've read a bunch of books about it, and there's no magic. I think you just had a bunch of, they had, Von Braun was another great guy who's played a management role. The guy who managed the lunar lander, he wrote a book about the lunar lander process. He seemed like a solid guy. I think a bunch of the right things came together, and there's no one element that I would call out and say, okay, we've got it. Now we just put that over here. There were too many factors. There's no algorithm. I don't know how you replicate that. In fact, you can look at NASA today and say how they're, gee, I mean, some of it you have to go back and say JFK planted the seed that was very clear and coherent and concise that people could refer back to. Maybe that was the closest thing to a magic element, is you had someone like him who began it in the right way, and then he died. So there might be a lot of mythological power in that story, but that's just my guessing. I'm going to wrap up. If you have more questions for me, feel free to come on up, and I'll hang out as long as you guys want to. But thank you for coming, and I hope you'll check out the book. Thank you.